The history books love to talk about the philosophers. They love to show you the white marble statues of men with long, curly beards, staring thoughtfully into the distance. They tell you about the golden age of Rome, a time when wisdom supposedly ruled the known world. It is a comfortable lie. It is a story designed for school children. The reality was much colder. The golden age did not end because of an idea. It ended because a teenage boy inherited a machine he did not understand, and a 33-year-old woman decided that the only way to save her family was to put a piece of sharpened iron into his ribs. Power at the summit of the Roman world was never about philosophy. It was about muscle memory. It was about counting the steps outside your bedroom door. And it was about knowing that the very same blood running through your veins is the exact reason someone is coming to cut your throat. The title of Augusta was not a gift. It was a sentence. Aeneia Aurelia Galeria Lucilla learned this before her body had even finished growing. She was the firstborn daughter of Marcus Aurelius, the man history remembers as the ultimate philosopher king. But Lucilla did not grow up in a library. She grew up in the shadow of an empire that stretched from the freezing fog of Scotland to the sun-baked dust of the Persian border. She grew up watching the gears of absolute power turn, and she knew that those gears required constant grease. Usually, that grease was human blood. Before she turned 15, the girl was already an empress. Her father did not look at her and see a daughter to be protected. He looked at her and saw a treaty written in skin. He needed to chain his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, to the family line. Distance makes generals ambitious, and Lucius was far away in the east, commanding legions against the Parthian Empire. A victorious general with half the army at his back is a dangerous thing. So, Marcus Aurelius played his most valuable card. He packed his 14-year-old daughter onto a wooden galley and sent her across the sea to Ephesus. She was a child delivered to the bed of a man more than twice her age. She did not cry. She did not protest. She walked under the massive marble columns of the eastern temples, listened to the foreign ambassadors whisper, and took the title of Augusta. Suddenly, her face was stamped onto silver denarii. Her profile was minted in Antioch and Alexandria. When she walked through the streets, the crowds did not just look at a girl. They looked at a living god. They threw wet rose petals at her sandals. They carried a sacred, flickering flame before her everywhere she went. It was a beautiful, intoxicating theater. But behind the theater, the child was watching. She sat at the edge of council chambers where men decided the fate of whole provinces with the flick of a finger. She saw how her husband ran campaigns from the shade of luxury villas. She learned the fundamental truth that her father left out of his philosophical journals. The Roman world was not held together by beautiful ideas. It was held together by gold, steel, and quietly disposed bodies. Then, the East sent a gift back to Rome. The legions returned with chests of gold, columns of slaves, and a sickness that rode silently inside their lungs. The Antonine Plague. It scythed through the empire like a scythe through wheat. It hit the cities, the military camps, and the ports. Carts rattled through the Roman night, stacked high with rotting corpses. In the winter of AD 169, the sickness caught Lucius Verus. A blood vessel inside his brain burst while he was riding in a carriage. He died with his eyes open and his mouth twisted. At 20 years old, Lucilla was a widow. In Rome, a wealthy, imperial widow was a loaded weapon. Any senator who married her would instantly inherit a legitimate claim to the throne. Her father knew this. He did not let her grieve. Before the funeral incense was even cold, he forced her into a second marriage with Claudius Pompeianus, an old, scarred general from the provinces. It was a calculated insult. Pompeianus was an equestrian, not an aristocrat. He was chosen because he was too lowborn to ever dream of seizing the throne. The marriage was a chemical agent designed to neutralize her. She was to be kept quiet. She was to be kept small. But the fire inside her did not die. It simply went underground, waiting for the cold wind to change. What truly bound a Roman emperor to his throne? A. Pure royal blood. B. Cold flesh treaties. C. Holy temple vows. D. Senate's golden seals. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The transition of power inside the Roman Empire was never a peaceful affair. It was a digital flip of a coin. In March of AD 180, on the frozen banks of the Danube, the coin landed on its edge. Marcus Aurelius, the architect of the Stoic peace, died inside a grey military tent. The official records muttered about an illness, a recurring wave of the plague that had thinned out his army for a decade. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the ring. The imperial signet was pulled from a dead father's cold, thin finger and pushed onto the warm, soft hand of a 19-year-old boy. Commodus was now the master of the world. Lucilla stood in the damp air of the northern camp and watched her little brother address the ranks of ironclad legionaries. He promised them gold. He promised them easy victories. He promised them everything they wanted to hear. Lucilla watched his lips move, and she knew every single word was a hallucination. Commodus had been raised inside the silk-lined walls of the palace. He had never scraped the frost off a shield. He had never seen a Germanic axe split a companion's skull down to the teeth. He was a creature of pure vanity, and the empire was a toy his father had left under his pillow. Within months, the rot showed its face. Commodus could not stand the smell of the northern pine forests. He hated the cold mud of the frontier. He signed a hasty, humiliating peace treaty with the tribes, abandoning territory his father had spent 20 years bleeding to defend. He ordered the court packed. He wanted Rome. He wanted the baths, the sweet wines, and the roar of the arena. When the imperial procession finally entered the capital, it was not a triumph of a general. It was a carnival. Commodus rode in a gold-plated chariot, waving to the plebeians like a conquering hero. But he hadn't conquered anything. He had surrendered ground. Sitting right beside him in the chariot, his arm draped casually over the emperor's shoulder, was Seodorus. He was a freedman. A palace servant who had crawled into the young ruler's inner circle with the silent patience of a tick. The senators, descendants of the men who had broken Carthage, watched from the Curia steps in silent, freezing rage. The new emperor was ranking a common slave above the scarred commanders of the legions. For Lucilla, the return to the city was the beginning of a slow, public execution of her status. The seating chart of the Roman court was not a matter of etiquette. It was a diagram of survival. When her father was alive, Lucilla sat at the front of every theater. Her name came first in every religious procession. The sacred flame walked before her sandals. But Commodus was a married man now. His new wife, Brutia Crispina, was the reigning empress. The transition was immediate and merciless. The protocol clerks did not hesitate. The sacred fire was taken from Lucilla and handed to Crispina. When the imperial family entered the amphitheater, the crowds no longer looked at Lucilla first. She was directed to the secondary row, forced to walk exactly one full pace behind her teenage sister-in-law. To the crowds in the sun, it was a minor change in the scenery. To the political operators of Rome, it was a signal. Lucilla's gravity was gone. The letters from distant governors stopped coming. The senators no longer waited outside her door for advice. She was 32 years old, her mind was sharper than anyone's inside the Palatine Hill, and she was being systematically erased from the record. She was being turned into a ghost while she was still breathing. And Lucilla knew, with the cold clarity of a woman who had watched 3 Caesars die, that erasure was only the first step. Paranoia was growing inside her brother's mind like a dark weed, and eventually, that weed would reach for her throat. Paranoia inside the Palatine Palace was not a silent thing. It had a sound. It was the sound of the Praetorian Guard's iron sandals striking the marble floors at odd hours of the night. It was the sudden, unexplained absence of a senator from his regular seat in the chamber. Commodus did not govern the state, he consumed it. The imperial treasury, drained by his father's long wars, was now completely empty. But the young emperor did not care about budgets. He cared about spectacles. He needed silver to buy thousands of wild animals from the African interior, panthers, lions, ostriches, elephants. He wanted them shipped to Rome so he could stand on a safe, elevated platform and shoot them with arrows while the mob cheered. To pay for the blood on the sand, Commodus began to harvest the aristocracy. Professional informers flooded the city. A wealthy patrician only had to look away during one of the emperor's circus performances to find himself accused of treason the next morning. His estates would be seized, his family thrown into the street, and his wealth transferred directly into the emperor's private accounts to fund the next round of games. The air in Rome grew heavy, wet with fear. Men went to bed wondering if they would see the sunrise, or if they would be forced to open their veins in a warm bath before dawn. Lucilla sat inside her villa on the edge of the city and watched the machine fall apart. She knew the mathematics of a tyrant's mind. She knew that proximity to the throne was a terminal condition. It was only a matter of time before Seatorus or another palace flatterer leaned toward her brother's ear and whispered her name. She was too respected. She was too intelligent. She was the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, and that alone made her a flag that a rebellious general could use to start a civil war. She decided she would not wait for the centurion to arrive with her death warrant. She would strike first. The conspiracy began with quiet dinners. Lucilla did not invite the loud, boastful critics of the regime. She selected her guests with the precision of a surgeon picking a blade. She invited men whose pride had been cut by the emperor's slights. She invited senators who remembered the steady, predictable justice of her father's reign. The food was simple. The wine was calculated. No musicians were allowed inside the room. There were only low voices and the flickering shadows of oil lamps against the wall. She did not use the word assassination. She spoke of her father's legacy instead. She asked her guests how long the Roman world could survive under the whims of a boy who wore a laurel crown but acted like a child at a carnival. She listened to the tremors in their voices, searching for the exact line where their fear turned into desperation. She found her primary tool in Ammidius Quadratus. He was young, fabulously wealthy, and politically connected to the highest circles of the state. He was also her lover. Quadratus was a man consumed by ambition, but he lacked the internal iron necessary to lead. Lucilla provided that iron. She wove a tight web of obligation around him, using his desire for power to anchor him to the plot. Her husband, the old general Pompeianus, was kept completely in the dark. He was too honorable, too deeply bound by his old oath to Marcus Aurelius, to ever support a strike against the imperial bloodline. Slowly, the shadow network grew. Lucilla quietly bought the loyalty of senators who controlled key factions in the capital. But a political plot without a weapon is just talk. They needed someone who could manage the immediate aftermath of the murder. They needed the guards. With Quadratus acting as the front, Lucilla reached into the command structure of the Praetorian Guard itself. She found Terratinius Paternus, the senior prefect of the Imperial Guard. Paternus was a cold, calculating professional. He did not care about saving the Republic, but he knew how to read a map. He saw that Commodus was a sinking ship, and he wanted to make sure his soldiers were on the winning side when the water rushed in. He agreed to hold the guards back. He agreed to let the corridor clear when the moment arrived. The clockwork bomb was assembled, ticking quietly just inches away from the Emperor's bedroom, waiting for a hand to pull the pin. Every conspiracy eventually comes down to a single piece of steel and a single human hand. Lucilla's network was vast, her gold had cleared the paths, and the prefect of the guard had promised his silence. But neither a senator nor a princess could slide a blade between the emperor's ribs themselves. They needed an executioner. Someone volatile enough to take the risk, yet blind enough to believe he would walk away a hero. They found him in Claudius Quintianus. He was a young patrician, the nephew of Lucilla's own husband, Pompeianus. He was arrogant, handsome, and prone to dramatic gestures. He despised Commodus with the pure, irrational hatred that only a spoiled young aristocrat can muster. Lucilla saw his vanity and turned it into a weapon. She placed the heavy iron dagger into his palm. The strategy was designed to exploit the very architecture of Roman entertainment. The Colosseum was an ocean of noise, but its underbelly was a labyrinth of tight, damp stone tunnels. To reach the imperial box, the emperor had to pass through a specific, poorly lit corridor. The walls were thick, the air was heavy with the smell of wild animal dung and wet torches, and the crowd's roar overhead was so loud it shook the masonry. In that passage, the emperor's massive security detail would be forced to walk in single file. The space would contract. For a few seconds, visibility would drop to nothing. That was the gap. Lucilla did not just want a murder. She wanted a political statement. She spent weeks drilling a single sentence into Quintianus's memory, burning it into his brain until he could say it without thinking. "This is what the Senate sends you." Those were the words. The murder was meant to be theater, a public declaration that the old order was reclaiming its power. With Commodus dead in the dirt of the tunnel, the Senate would instantly declare a new emperor, perhaps Quadratus, perhaps another puppet of Lucilla's choosing. She would move from the secondary rows back to the very center of the world. She would be the mind behind the throne. The spring of AD 182 arrived. The city vibrated with the heavy, nervous energy of the blood games. The sun beat down on the red brick walls of the amphitheater as thousands of citizens shoved through the narrow gates. Inside his private dressing rooms, Commodus adjusted his ceremonial silk and laced his golden sandals, completely oblivious to the iron point waiting for him in the dark. Miles away, inside her windowless villa chamber, Lucilla sat completely still in a wooden chair. The dice had left her fingers. She traced the cold silver rim of a cup, counting the seconds in her head, waiting for the sound of a galloping horse to bring her the news of her brother's death. She could see it in her mind, the blade going in, the sudden gorgeous vacuum where his tyranny used to be. Meanwhile, inside the stone throat of the stadium passage, Quintianus pressed his sweating back against the damp brick. He gripped the wooden hilt of the dagger beneath his heavy wool cloak. The iron was warm now, slick with his own grease. Then came the sound. The synchronized, rhythmic hammer of iron-soled sandals. The imperial party was moving into the trap. Quintianus took one deep breath, stepped clear of the shadow, and lunged into the torchlight. He had the emperor perfectly positioned. Commodus was unarmed, dressed in pale silk, his personal guard temporarily jammed behind a sharp bend in the masonry. The distance was short, less than 3 paces. A single, rapid forward thrust into the soft tissue of the throat would have ended the Antonine dynasty right there. But Quintianus did not thrust. The theatrics consumed him. He stopped dead in his tracks, lifted the blade high above his shoulder so the orange lamp oil could glint off the iron, and screamed the line Lucilla had taught him, "This is what the Senate sends you." It was a fatal performance. He stood there with his arm frozen in the air, paralyzed by the sheer, staggering weight of what he was about to do. He was looking directly into the eyes of a 19-year-old boy who was worshipped as a living god across 3 continents. In that single heartbeat of hesitation, the future of the Roman world shifted its tracks. The Praetorians did not have an internal monologue. They were veteran killers who had survived winters slaughtering northern tribesmen in the frozen mud. They operated on pure, conditioned reflex. Before the sentence had even finished echoing through the stone arches, 2 armored guards lunged forward. Their massive shoulders slammed into Quintianus, driving his spine flat against the Roman masonry with a sickening thud. The iron dagger flew from his fingers and clattered loudly against the stone floor, its metallic ring swallowed instantly by the roaring crowd upstairs. Commodus did not scream. He did not step back. He simply lowered his head and stared at the glittering weapon on the ground, then looked up at the young patrician whose lip was already split and bleeding under the guard's iron grip. The emperor understood the signal perfectly. The Senate had not sent a petition. They had mailed him a knife. He turned on his heel and walked out of the tunnel without saying a word. The games would go on, but the boy was finished being an emperor. He was ready to become something else. The Castra Praetoria did not have windows. It was a massive, red brick fortress sitting on the northeastern edge of Rome, a place where the ordinary laws of the Roman Republic went to die. Under the old traditions, the body of a Roman senator was legally sacred. He could not be beaten by common soldiers. He could not be bound to a rack. But those rules vanished the moment the clerks wrote the word maestas on the ledger. Treason against the divine person of the emperor dissolved all aristocratic privilege. In the basement of the fortress, an aristocrat's skin peeled away from his ribs just as easily as a slave's. The specialists of the guard stripped Quintianus naked and hung him from iron rings set deep into the stone ceiling. They did not work with anger. They were technicians of pain, approaching the human nervous system with the cold, measured efficiency of a carpenter splitting timber. They used the flagrum, a heavy whip braided with lead balls designed to tear flesh into bright red ribbons. They applied calibrated heat to his joints. Quintianus had grown up drinking chilled wine on cushions stuffed with goose down. He possessed none of the silent, stoic endurance his uncle had learned on the Danube frontier. He broke within the first hour. He shouted names into the damp dark. He gave them the senators who had nodded in approval at Lucilla's dinners. He gave them the financiers who had provided the gold. He gave them his own co-conspirator, Ammidius Quadratus. And finally, when the lead balls had exposed the white bone of his shoulders, he gave them his architect. He gave them Lucilla. The sun was still setting behind the Tiber when the heavy boots marched up the sweeping gravel drive of Lucilla's villa. She was already sitting in a carved wooden chair near the central atrium pool, dressed in the formal wool stola of a Roman matron. Information traveled through the slave networks of the city faster than horses could gallop down the highways. She already knew the blade had failed. She did not run. There was no corner of the Mediterranean where running would save her. Her husband, Pompeianus, stood near the water in stunned, dead silence. He had spent his afternoon reviewing troop deployments for the Rhine. He had no idea his wife had spent her winter sliding a dagger into the hand of his own nephew. The Praetorians did not knock. They drove the heavy oak doors off their hinges with their shoulders. Armored men flooded across the marble floor, their hands resting on the pommels of drawn short swords. The commanding officer did not bow. He did not address her as Augusta. He stood over her and unrolled a parchment bearing the heavy red wax seal of Commodus. With a single sentence, Lucilla was stripped of every imperial title she had carried since childhood. Her vast personal wealth was confiscated by the fiscus, the emperor's private treasury. She was placed under immediate arrest. Pompeianus watched the guards lift his wife by her arms. He did not draw his sword. He did not offer a word of protest. He played the part of the loyal, oblivious old soldier with perfect conviction, and that performance alone kept his head attached to his neck. Quadratus was dragged from his bed that same night and beheaded in his own rose garden. Quintianus was executed inside his cell, the cleaning of the stone floor afterward taking longer than the actual killing. But for Lucilla, Commodus hesitated. Despite her treason, she was still the eldest daughter of Marcus Aurelius. The legions on the frontiers still worshipped her father's memory like a religion. Executing her openly in the capital risked a military mutiny or a bloody riot in the streets. Commodus reached for the traditional Roman tool-kit for dealing with royal women who knew too much. He ordered erasure through exile. Lucilla was packed into a small, closed wooden wagon with heavy canvas curtains lashed shut to hide her face from the public. They rolled down the Via Appia, passing the tall marble tombs of her ancestors in the long, dusty afternoon light. She would never see the streets of Rome again. At the naval port of Misenum, she was transferred onto a small military skiff and rowed across the Bay of Naples toward the sheer, limestone cliffs of Capri. Capri was not a holiday retreat. It was a haunted house wearing a beautiful face. A century earlier, the Emperor Tiberius had moved his entire court to this exact island to escape his own terrors. He had built the Villa Jovis, a massive complex of terraces and stone chambers perched directly on the edge of a vertical 300-meter drop into the sea. Tiberius had transformed the island into a private slaughterhouse, breaking his political enemies in the cellars and ordering his guards to hurl the shattered bodies off the rock face into the jagged surf below. The local fishermen still called the spot the Leap of Tiberius. This was Lucilla's new prison. She was locked inside the rotting masonry of another emperor's madness. For months, she lived in enforced silence. Her guards were forbidden from speaking to her. She had only her young daughter, Placia, for company. They spent their afternoons walking across the cracked mosaic floors of the half-abandoned villa, listening to the wind shriek through the roofless colonnades, staring across the blue water at the faint smudge of the Italian mainland. She had been completely deleted from the running record of the Roman world, while back in the capital, her brother was preparing to burn her father's legacy to the ground. The winter of AD 182 did not arrive with snow on Capri. It arrived with violent, iron-gray storms that tore off the Tyrrhenian Sea and slammed into the white limestone cliffs with a sound like cracking ribs. Inside the eastern wing of the Villa Jovis, Lucilla measured the slow collapse of her life by watching the horizon disappear behind sheets of freezing rain. She was 33 years old. Her skin had grown pale from the damp air of the stone chambers, but her mind remained perfectly level. She understood the cold arithmetic of Roman survival. In her world, exile was rarely a permanent condition, it was a waiting room. She held on to a single, highly calculated hope. Empires were volatile things. If her brother offended the wrong general on the Danube or the Rhine, the legions would march. If a usurper seized the Palatine Hill, that new ruler would need political legitimacy in a hurry. There was no faster way to buy the affection of the Roman public than by sending a fleet to rescue the eldest daughter of Marcus Aurelius from her island cage. All she had to do was outlast the boy in Rome. She had to stay hidden, stay quiet, and keep her bloodline alive. But Commodus was not distracted. Paranoia is not a temporary mood, it is a chronic, degenerative condition that requires fresh fuel every single day. Every time the young emperor stepped into the Senate chamber and saw the forced, sweating smiles of the aristocracy, his mind returned to the damp throat of the amphitheater tunnel. He remembered the orange torchlight glinting off the iron blade. He remembered the shouted phrase, "This is what the Senate sends you." The physical weapon had been broken, but the brain that had designed the strike was still breathing on an island down south. As long as Lucilla existed, she was a living banner that any ambitious general could raise to start a civil war. In the final days of the winter, Commodus sat alone in his private quarters on the Palatine Hill. He unrolled a large parchment map of the Italian peninsula across his desk, his index finger tracing the jagged coastline past the Bay of Naples until it stopped on the tiny dot of Capri. The conclusion settled into his fractured mind with a kind of absolute, soothing relief. Exile was a half measure. Half measures left loose ends. A severed head, on the other hand, cannot plot a rebellion. He summoned a veteran centurion of the Praetorian Guard. He did not issue a public decree, he melted red wax onto a square of fresh parchment, pressed his heavy gold signet ring into the cooling pool, and handed the rolled scroll to the officer. It was a lethal mandate that required no court, no trial, and no judicial review. The objective was the total extinction of his own remaining bloodline. Back on the island, the storms had finally rolled past, surrendering to the deceptive, glassy calm of early spring. Lucilla sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the regular, peaceful breathing of her daughter, Placia, through the thin connecting wall. And then, cutting through the quiet creak of the cypress trees, came the wrong sound. The dense, synchronized hammer of hobnailed sandals striking the steep stone path up from the docks. It was the drilled cadence of the Praetorians. They were not slowing down. The heavy oak door of her bedchamber buckled inward under a massive shoulder. The iron hinges shrieked against the stone frame, the sound traveling down the empty marble corridors like a wounded animal. The centurion stepped across the threshold into the dim room. He did not draw his short sword. Splashing royal blood across the mosaic floor of a provincial villa was viewed by the state as a kind of theological mess. The military apparatus preferred cleaner, quieter tools. The officer uncoiled a laqueus from his belt, a thick, tightly braided leather cord engineered specifically for strangulation. He did not speak. He did not read a formal sentence. Lucilla rose from the bed to meet him. She did not weep, and she did not beg for her life. She had been raised at the absolute summit of global power, and she understood the engineering of a purge better than the man standing in her doorway. She knew that in the cold mathematics of empire, her continued existence was simply a calculation error that her brother was finally erasing. The centurion stepped behind her and looped the leather cord around her throat. He drew the two ends sharply outward, crossing his armored forearms behind her skull to multiply the leverage. The pressure crushed her windpipe instantly, flattening the carotid arteries and cutting the supply of oxygen to her brain. Her back stayed rigid for a few stubborn seconds, her fingers clawing uselessly at the leather, before her nervous system finally unplugged itself. The eldest daughter of Marcus Aurelius collapsed onto the cold stone floor. The mandate, however, was not complete. The centurion stepped over her body and walked through the arched doorway into the adjoining room. Placia was still curled beneath her wool blanket, her cheek pressed to the pillow. In the ancient world, the execution of a child was not recorded as an atrocity, it was standard political housekeeping. Bloodlines were the most dangerous weapons in circulation. If the girl were allowed to grow, she would eventually marry an ambitious senator and carry the Antonine claim to the throne inside the marrow of her bones. Her future sons would be a permanent threat to the Palatine Hill. The Praetorian Guard did not leave loose ends. The child died in the dark without ever knowing why the world was unsafe. There was no state funeral for the former empress and her daughter. Their bodies were carried out to the lip of the white limestone cliff and dropped into the deep blue water of the Tyrrhenian Sea, scrubbed from the physical world exactly as the emperor had commanded. When the courier returned to Rome and confirmed the execution, the last thin dam inside the mind of Commodus ruptured. The death of his sister was supposed to bring him peace, but instead, it proved to him that absolute loyalty was a fairy tale. If his own flesh and blood, the woman who had shared his childhood meals, was willing to drive a knife into his throat, then every human being in the capital was a potential assassin hiding behind a polite smile. The targeted political operation of AD 182 mutated into a blind, sprawling, 10-year spiral of paranoia and delusion. Commodus divorced his wife, Brutia Crispina, under a fabricated charge of adultery, exiled her to the exact same rooms on Capri, and sent another centurion with another leather cord to discard her body in the same surf. He executed the greatest generals of his generation simply to confiscate their fortunes and fund his gladiatorial spectacles. He abandoned the toga of a magistrate to parade through the palace draped in a lion's skin, dragging a heavy wooden club, demanding the Senate worship him as the living reincarnation of Hercules. He forced the state to rename the Eternal City itself to Colonia Commodiana, turning the empire into a hostage crisis on a continental scale. The breaking point finally arrived on the final night of AD 192. His inner circle, including his favorite concubine, Marcia, discovered their own names written on a wax kill list on the emperor's desk. Proximity to the throne had remained a terminal condition. They had no time to recruit senators or hire assassins, they had to strike before the sun rose on the new year. Marcia dosed the emperor's post-bath wine with a lethal mixture of hemlock and monkshood. But Commodus carried the heavy physical engine of an athlete, his body rejected the poison, and he began vomiting violently on the floor of the imperial bathhouse. Terrified that he would survive the night, the conspirators ran into the corridors and recruited Narcissus, a massive, slab-shouldered professional wrestler who served as the emperor's personal trainer. Narcissus entered the caldarium, the steam-saturated chamber of the baths. The air was so thick with vapor it felt physical, condensation sliding down the vaulted ceilings. The master of the known world, the tyrant whose word had killed thousands, was naked on his hands and knees on the wet tiles, gasping for breath. The wrestler did not use a weapon. He locked his thick forearms around the imperial throat from behind, clamping down on the carotids. Even half-poisoned, Commodus fought with the desperate, thrashing strength of a dying animal, his bare feet skidding against the slick marble. But Narcissus dropped his weight low, tightened his grip, and squeezed until the thrashing stopped and the spine went completely limp. The corpse of the emperor hit the wet floor with a soft, heavy slap. 10 years after Lucilla had sat in her windowless room and calculated the trajectory of her brother's madness, her diagnosis was finally vindicated by the vomit and blood on the bathhouse floor. She had been the first to recognize that the boy was a monster. The rest of the Roman world simply needed a decade of corpses to arrive at the exact same conclusion. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.